You just have to have this attitude of never stop learning, I would say, because science is changing so quickly. Our understanding of health is changing very, very quickly. I think just being able to, first of all, not get overwhelmed. That's the first thing I would counsel to people, because, man, as soon as you start working on your health and you start acquiring information, it's like a tsunami of stuff you can find out there. And it can get very overwhelming very fast for people just getting into this game. So I think I've had to really learn how to just be able to not get overwhelmed with information, be able to take in information and decide what from that I want to process and what I want to discard, being able to pick one or two things at a time that I want to try and measure, and just working on a couple things that I can really test objectively and get some feedback. And then as I mentioned, it's always changing. As science evolves, I think we have to just keep an open mind, and what we thought works today, in a few years from now, it turns out we might be totally wrong.
Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It is my pleasure to have David Korsunsky with us. David is the founder and CEO of Heads Up, a digital health analytics company based in Scottsdale, Arizona. As an avid health enthusiast, David created Heads Up to make it easier for anyone to take control over their health through more effective use of their data. David, it's so great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Stephan. I know we've been trying to connect for quite some time now after our meeting in Miami Beach, Florida, if my memory serves me correctly.
At a biohacking congress.
Congress event. So here we are, full circle. It took us a while, but we got there.
Yes. And so I would, first of all, love to hear, and I know my listener will love to hear your origin story. Your superhero origin story? How did you end up changing so many people's lives as you do with your Heads Up technology and platform?
Yeah, well, I was working in the technology industry. I'm not in healthcare by training. My background is in technology, not unlike yours. And my job was to go into these large computer data centers with the size of a football field. And my job was to go figure out why the system was running slow. So you're looking for a needle in the haystack at that point. And so one of the techniques we would use is we would go collect 7 days of performance data on every single machine in the system. Hundreds upon hundreds of individual servers, and each server had hundreds of performance statistics, and each of those hundreds of performance statistics were being measured every 20 seconds. So you get this mountain of data back. And then you have to go basically retroactively analyze the patterns and see where the breakpoints were in performance. That's pretty standard analytics stuff. Every industry has this. But I got really, really good at doing that. This was right around the time when some of the first consumer-grade health sensors were hitting the market. Some of your listeners might remember the Zeo, which was this headband you wore. And it was like the coolest thing in the world back in 2011. Like the first consumer device that gave you some actionable data about your sleep. And I started making...
I had one.
I did too. And actually seeing the biofeedback helped me realize that I had some work to do on my sleep quality. Subjectively, I would have told you I was sleeping fine. But when I really looked at the numbers, it turned out I was getting a lot less sleep than I thought. Sometimes less than 6 hours, most nights somewhere between 6 and 7. But then I went on the Zeo website and there was all these awesome tips on how to improve your sleep environment, the quality of your mattress, the temperature of the room, eliminating ambient light, avoiding meals before bed. And I just went down the rabbit hole on this because I would feel so much better as I started improving my health. So as I got deeper into this whole world of quantified self, which is what it was called at the time. Now I think biohacking is the term du jour, but back then it was called quantified self. I started seeing the same problem I had in my day job. Hey, there's all this data here, but there's no real tools to help people make any sense out of it. And I'm like, well, I know how to solve that problem. We just need to pull together some good tool sets here. And actually, we wanted to make the tool set available to individuals who were starting to become invested in their health, because it was traditionally the doctors that had those tools. You'd go to the doctors and they'd pull up your data on some screen. You never see the screen, but they'd pull it up and there it is. Or you could log into your underwhelming patient portal and try to look at some of your stats there.
Yeah.
But it was just like, it was terrible. So that's when I started to work on the first integrated health dashboard in 2015. while I was still gainfully employed. And then I took the leap of faith. An investor offered me some money to quit my job and go do it full time. And I was making pretty good money at that time. And I had a pretty cushy setup. I'd made my director level company. I had respect. I had the salary, the title, all of the trappings you'd need. Ride that sucker out for the next 20 years. Or I could go knock on this other door here and jump off a cliff with no parachute. So,
But the old adage, leap and a net will appear.
So I leaped, and it's just been the most amazing, beautiful, challenging, rewarding experience I could have ever possibly imagined.
Yeah, amazing. And so when did you go full time into this business and get that investor signing on?
That was in the summer of 2017. Someone writes you a check for $100,000 as a first-time founder, you're doing backflips. You know what I mean? And then you realize that like 5 months later, you're like, okay, that money's gone. So now what? And then you got to go figure it out. You got to go figure out how to capitalize your company. And that's a whole multi-year process of learning how to work with investors and learning how to raise money. That's a skill set I didn't have. I'd never done that before. I'd been a salaried employee. So you got to go figure that whole thing out. But it's been 7 years since I've been full-time on the project. 6.5, roughly. 7, summer of 2000. Yeah. Cool. Knocking on 7. Yeah.
Awesome. And you mentioned that you started all this out because you were trying to improve your sleep and use the ZEO as a measurement tool. What did you end up doing that made the biggest difference in the numbers for you?
Well, the ZEO was one thing, Stephan, but you may recall at that time some of the early luminaries in quantified self were guys like Tim Ferriss and Dave Asprey and Rob Wolf, and they were writing books and publishing on the topic. And I discovered the DEXA scan from Tim Ferriss's book. So I started getting DEXA scans and getting more detailed information on my body composition. So, the ZEO was just the gateway drug into like health data that got me hooked. And then I started doing DEXA scans, and then I started changing my diet. So the first major step for me health-wise was actually just learning how to get off of the standard American diet, get off processed foods. And at that time, it was the paleo diet, but the paleo diet was more of a unprocessed, low carbohydrate diet. So as soon as I did that for a few months, all my blood tests, they didn't necessarily get better in the way that traditional medicine. My cholesterol went up. I was eating more fat in my diet, but my body composition changed a lot. I lost a lot of weight that I had not been able to lose for 5 or 7 years around the midsection just by learning how to cut out processed foods. So that was the first big leap. And then I took it a step further when I discovered the ketogenic diet. And the difference between paleo, which is what I had been doing, and ketogenic was with ketogenic, I really had to carefully measure my blood sugar and my ketones because you cannot get into ketosis if you're consuming too much carbohydrate. So it was just that next level of detail you needed to be able to get into a state of ketogenesis. Once I was in ketosis for the first time, I'd never felt like I had that much control over my appetite before. It was the most powerful appetite regulation that I'd ever felt being in ketosis. Like you could have put my favorite cheeseburger and fries right in front of me. When I'm in ketosis, I can just, politely push it aside and say, I'm just going to have something more low carb. But when you're not in ketosis, those cravings are back. So that was the next major leap of faith. And then it's just been an experiment to all types of health optimization, hyperbaric therapy, peptides, you name it. I've tried it at this point, largely because I want to learn what these modalities do. They inform how we build our software, but also they're just part of my quest for what I call continuous health optimization.
Awesome.
Real time.
So when you started with the ZEO,
yeah,
and you read some tips for your sleep,
yeah,
and you implemented that. I
did, yeah.
You went through and got rid of all the ambient light, and you lowered the temperature in the room, and all those different things.
Correct. Yep.
What of the sleep optimization tactics really made the difference for you? It moved the needle the most?
The biggest one for me would have been room temperature, quite honestly. And what I started to realize is that the colder the room was, even though you're not cold in bed you're actually warm, but your head is cool. And it was lowering the ambient temperature in the room. that had the biggest impact. The second biggest was simply just being mindful of how much sleep I was getting in total volume, because my previous mode of operating would have been to just wake up at 6 a.m, go get my coffee, and commute down to Palo Alto. But I realized in most nights that was only leading to 5.5, 6 hours of sleep. And so I did not have enough data to know that it was that low. The data actually helped me realize that it was lower than I subjectively thought it was. So it was just seeing the numbers made me perhaps go to bed a little earlier and sleep in a little bit later, and try to get towards 7 or 8. So it was just room temperature, and then just having some actual actionable data that helped me realize I need more. Those were the two big ones on sleep.
Gotcha. And so nowadays there are a lot more options than the Zio. You have the Aura Ring, you have other kinds of wearables, a Fitbit or something. I use the Aura Ring. What kind of measurements are the most important from a sleep perspective? Is it deep sleep? Is it REM sleep? Is it overall sleep? Is it a sleep quality score, which I guess would change depending on which device and software you're using? What are the biggest, most important metrics here?
I think as you mentioned, from device to device, Whoop, Garmin, Aura, Fitbit, etc., they all have different algorithms for how they're going to measure deep sleep, REM sleep. So I think once you settle on a device, you can start to loosely optimize those stages. There's some debate about how we're even classifying those as stages, and so there's debate about whether those are the right ones to use. For me, there's a couple that I look at very closely. The first is my resting heart rate during the night. So as an Aura user, Stephan, I'm sure you've seen on the readiness tab, you can look at your resting heart rate. And that really gives you an indication, first of all, how low did your heart rate go that night? And the more rested you are, the lower your heart rate will go. On a really well-rested night, I'll be as low as 45 beats per minute. On a day where I've overtrained, I could be as much as 55 beats per minute. So, and we also work with a lot of professional sports teams. So I've asked them, what are you looking at with your athletes in this data? Because these are the people at the highest end of human performance. So they're looking at resting heart rate. How low did it go? And when did it hit its lowest point? That's an Aura number. And the second number I look at is my nocturnal heart rate variability. And I probably look at that as the most important, even more so than sleep score, readiness score.
Gotcha. And can you describe HRV, heart rate variability?
Yeah, heart rate variability. Yep. So heart rate variability and resting heart rate would be the two that I'm paying most attention to. The third is just this nice handy little AM readiness score, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is a nice little roll up of the data. So I'll quickly glance at that in the morning, but the real numbers I look at are resting heart rate and heart rate variability.
And can you describe HRV, heart rate variability, why it's important, and what is the canary in the coal mine for like a poor score? What does that mean?
Sure. Well, heart rate variability has been used in the professional sports community for a very long time. And prior to the Aura Ring, you would just put a heart rate monitor on, a chest strap, and you'd sit still for 5 minutes in the morning, and it would spit out your reading. And that's actually still a very reliable way to do it. So even if you don't have a sleep device that measures heart rate variability, you can buy a Bluetooth heart rate monitor, chest strap, and there's apps on your phone. You wake up, you sit for 3 to 5 minutes, you get an HRV reading. Essentially, heart rate variability is different than heart rate. Your heart rate is how many times per minute your heart's beating, 45 beats per minute. But between each heartbeat, there's an elapsed period of time, typically about 1,000 milliseconds between each beat. Boom, boom, boom. But it's never exactly 1,000. Sometimes it's 997 milliseconds. Sometimes it's 1,002. So there's variation between each heartbeat. That's why they call it heart rate variability. Now, the more variability you have between each heartbeat, okay, that's actually an indicator that your central nervous system is well rested and well recovered. So it's a little counterintuitive. More variability between the beats represents an autonomic nervous system that is in a state of recovery and repair and balance. Less variability indicates an autonomic nervous system that's under duress. That's a rough way to put it. Simply put, Stephan, it's the most accurate way we have today to put a number around stress on the body. Stress is a very nebulous term, right? I'm stressed out. I'm under a lot of stress. I'm in a high stress period, but there's no way to quantify it. think of HRV as a way to quantify stress. Now, stress can be emotional, like something that's happening to you in your workplace. It can be something that's happening to you with a family member or a loved one or a colleague. So there's that emotional stress. It could be from a traumatic event that's happened to you. So there's that part. There's also physical stress, which is like you have an injury on your body, a broken bone or a virus, for example. And then the other type of stressor can be environmental. And that would typically be things like heavy metals, things that we take in from our environment, like EMF, poor air quality, these types of things that we're taking in through our food, our air, our water. So those are all definitions of stressors on the body. So HRV is a way to measure stress. So the other part to your question is like, what's the canary in the coal mine? And as you start looking at heart rate variability, you'll realize that, for example, alcohol. When you have alcohol, that will significantly decrease your heart rate variability. If you use tobacco before bed, cannabis before bed, a body that's overtired, let's say you're traveling and you're out of your home environment, you're on a different time zone, you're sleeping in a hotel, it's uncomfortable. So anything that causes a stress on the body will decrease heart rate variability. And when you can learn to optimize that number, I think it's probably of the thousands of biomarkers we look at on a day-to-day basis at our company. If you ask me to pick one, it'd be heart rate variability, that you should learn what it is and learn how to optimize for it.
Gotcha. And so what was your, if you're willing to share, what was your HRV score when you kind of started all this work of optimizing your own health? And then what is it now?
You know, it's funny because I have 5 years of data in Aura. And like lots of things, it ebbs and flows. And I can see periods in my life in 2020, 2021, where I was at an extremely high state of heart rate variability. That's also when I was doing a lot of cardiovascular conditioning. So having a really strong heart muscle, if your heart is stronger, you're actually going to be more efficient with blood flow. Your heart rate, your resting heart rate is going to be lower. That correlates with high heart rate variability. So I could see the times when I was training really hard and I was in good physical condition, my HRV was up. Then I got injured. I got plantar fasciitis. And for the next 2 years, my heart rate variability went down way below where I was before. And now I'm starting to run again, and I'm starting to do hyperbaric therapy and starting to do some other things. And just within the last 3 weeks, Stephan, it started to come back up to those levels I was at a few years ago. But I think the most important thing is to be able to look back and say, okay, wow, I know I can be at this level. I've been at this level before. I've fallen off here for a year or two while I was injured or sick or too busy to really train the way I want to train. But you know where your baseline is. So now I'm back to, not exactly back, but I'm getting close to where I was 2 or 3 years ago. So again, this is where we use data, not just day to day, but now looking at that data over the last 5 years, longitudinally, actually can be very insightful.
Awesome. And you're tracking that not just with your inside your Oura Ring app, but you're also tracking it in your software too.
Correct. Yeah. So our software will allow you to synchronize your Oura Ring with our system. And then we can look at other metrics besides the sleep data. We can look at other indicators of health. Like I have a dashboard with my Oura data, but I also have my VO2 max on there. I also have my weight and my body fat percentage. I also have the blood sugar data that I'm looking at. I also have all the
You're wearing the continuous glucose monitor. For those who are listening and not watching, you just showed you're wearing a CGM.
Yeah, so I want to look at all my health data in one place. You're an SEO guy, right? So like the value of having all the stats in one place. And as you know, getting all the stats to feed into one system, even in marketing analytics, is really hard. You got to go write your own script sometimes to pump data from A to B. So our dashboard kind of does that for you automatically. We just synthesize it all for you. So yeah, we look at Aura, but put that in the context of all your other health information.
Mm-hmm. And are you tracking macros using some app or some other approach? Because that's something that I've understood to be important for gaining muscle and lowering body fat percentage and so forth. But it's a lot of work, and it's a lot of manually entering stuff into an app like MyFitnessPal.
Yeah, there's some good ones out there. MyFitnessPal, Chronometer. We pull the data in from both of those. But as you mentioned, it's tedious to be punching everything that you eat into an app every day. Luckily, these apps are getting very sophisticated. You can just scan the barcode on a package. Some of them you just take a picture now, and they can use AI to deduce the food. But really, what you want to do is you want to track your macronutrient intake at least for a week or two, and maybe every so often to do what I just call like a reality check on yourself. And what you really want to look at is of the 2,000 calories or whatever I eat on a day to day basis, what percentage of those came from protein versus fat versus carbohydrate? And generally speaking, if you're looking to keep body fat in check and you're looking to drop weight, you're going to want to try to minimize refined carbohydrate intake, and you're going to try to maximize protein. And then you can use fat basically as kind of a hunger lever, if you will. So, for example, bulletproof coffee or some macadamia nuts. These are very high calorie foods. They have a lot of high fat in there. So what the high fat foods is they tell your body that you're full. So instead of reaching for chips, for example, or something that's got a higher blood sugar load, you can satisfy that with some salted macadamia nuts, for example. Your blood sugar doesn't budge. So I think it's helpful for everybody to at least learn how to understand what they're putting in their body. Track your food for a week, look at protein, fat, carbohydrate, and then you can adjust that balance to achieve your health goals. If you're super fit and super athletic and you're training hard every day, probably eat whatever the heck you want. But if you're a regular desk job
Maybe
person
not
like
Twinkies though.
no, but they can go eat a ton of food because they're burning 2,000 calories a day. You can burn 1,000 calories in one intense workout. So obviously you've got to calibrate it. But let's just take people who are sitting at information workers like you and I, for instance, that aren't professional athletes. If we want to really self-optimize body composition, then we need to know how to control our macronutrients, which is protein, fat, carbs. It's an insightful exercise to do once or twice. And then let's say you got to drop 10 pounds, you might need to start tracking again. And you might need to be accountable to yourself. The nice thing, Stephen, about the continuous glucose monitor right here, this can actually be a surrogate for tracking your macros. Because with this handy little device, all I do is make sure that I'm keeping my blood sugar in check. And I'm avoiding these high blood sugar spikes from processed foods. That gets me pretty much in the ballpark of where I want to be with where I used to track macronutrients. So as long as I'm keeping this in check, I'm pointing to my CGM now, I can be reasonably assured that I'm maintaining a healthy level of carbohydrate. And then I just make sure that I'm eating adequate protein on a day-to-day basis. And you don't necessarily need to do the detailed macronutrient tracking as much, but it can still be very helpful.
So apparently there's a wearable that tracks your macros. So you don't have to figure it out and write it down and scan barcodes and all that. It's a smart band called the Healbee Gobi 3. So the Gobi 3 from Healbee is a tracking device that tracks calorie intake, body hydration, and stress levels. I actually have one that's a Gobi 2. Yeah, I think this is the Gobi 2 or maybe even the Gobi 1. Now, this one's the original Gobi 1 that I'm holding right now. And I never ended up getting into using it. So I think I wore it once and that's it. I just didn't.
I'd be interested to see how they do that. Presumably, they're measuring HRV and something. I don't know how they'd measure the macronutrients through maybe through heart rate.
Well, what they do is they shine a light on your capillaries and measure the blood going through there. And I don't know exactly how they're doing it, but it's an estimate of your macros, proteins and fats and all that. And
if it gets you in the ballpark, if it gets in the ballpark and can at least get you a reasonable approximation. As I mentioned before, when I first did the ketogenic diet, you have to keep your carbs under 20 grams a day for 3 or 4 days to get into ketosis. Well, what the heck does 20 grams of carbs even mean? If you've never counted that before, it's meaningless. Like what the heck is that? 20 grams? So then you got to start tracking it all. It's a really a good educational exercise to do. I'd love it if there were more passive ways to collect the data, like you described with the Gobi. I think it would be interesting to find easier ways to get that information.
Cool. And so when someone is using your health dashboard, are they getting actionable insights and recommendations, or they're just getting the data that then they need to figure out, like, what are the things I'm going to do to improve my sleep hygiene because these numbers suck? Or what do I do now to improve my cholesterol and triglyceride levels, because over time I'm trending much worse than I thought when I show all the back-to-back scans, blood test results across the last 5 years.
So we kind of looked at it as a three-part problem. The first part of the problem was, can we even get this data glued together? That was the first problem we had to solve, because you've got all these doctors' patient portals, 20,000 of them in the United States. Can we get all those to pump data into one system? So first it was like, can we solve the plumbing problem? So we worked on that. And then the second problem was, could we, just from analyzing and visualizing the data, is there an actual business there? Like, can we monetize will people pay money for the app, basically? Will doctors pay money to use this in their clinic? So we spent the next chunk of time on that. We've just started releasing our first recommendations, which is what you described. But rather than making recommendations, Stephan, like, for example, we noticed X is low, try Y. What we've focused on instead is helping to identify positive trends in the data and surface those to the individual. So it becomes very easy to know when you did something right. And then you can say, okay, what did I do? What actions did I take that led me to that positive outcome? And you might say, oh, wow, I finished eating dinner at 4 p.m. last night and did some meditation before. Oh, okay, so that's what got me. So we're really trying to teach people to recreate the things that lead to success. We also work a lot with medical professionals who use the software with their patients or clients every day. And they will ask us to find signals in the data that get surfaced to them. And then they'll reach out to you with a set of recommendations, because health is such an individualized N of one topic, Stephan, that each person sometimes, what a good score for you might be a terrible score for the next person. And because we work with everything from diabetes clinics to professional athletes, it makes the recommendations really hard. So we've chosen to focus mainly on the analytics, which is, we're going to glue it all together. We're going to make it intelligent to understand. You'll pretty much kind of have to figure out how you want to attack it on your own, but we'll also give you the data to know if what you're doing is working. So we've stayed away from recommendations, protocol development, that kind of thing, and focused more on, like, okay, is this even working? There's lots of great health programs out there that will help you with whatever your goal is. Weight loss, disease management. We don't do that type of content. What we really want to do is just have the measurement platform. And that may change as we grow, but that's where we're at in our current instantiation.
Okay, got it. When you don't get enough measurements on a particular metric, then it's hard to make a change because you don't see a trend. If, for example, you got a DEXA scan once every 5 years, that's not going to be very useful for you. So in the case of a DEXA scan, how often do you recommend, or had you gotten scanned when you discovered the DEXA and you wanted to start using that as a measurement device?
Yeah, I got my first scan. I think my body fat percentage was like 27%. I'm like, whoa, okay, I've got some serious work to do here at my age. You know what I mean? So I started working really hard on it. And at that time, I was going every 6 months for a DEXA scan, because I was making changes between those scans that I wanted to give it at least 6 months to see if it was working. Changing my training regimen, changing my diet. So when I'm really focused on it every 6 months, I'd say at least once a year. And then between those, I just have a regular bathroom scale that I bought, that is, when I step on it, the same day as my DEXA scan. I know they're pretty close. So at least the body fat is close to the DEXA scan. So I'll use that between the DEXA scans just to get some more frequent calibration. So that's kind of the cadence I use for DEXA. And then as I'm aging, right, I'm now 47 years old. It's interesting to see, well, okay, what were my DEXA scans when I was 10 years younger, for example? And if you read any of Peter Attia's work, he's basically saying you should be optimizing your metrics. If you really want to live 60, 70, 80, 90 years old with a very high quality of life, disease-free, really thriving in those later stages of life, you should be at the highest percentile of your current age bracket for body fat or VO2 max. But you should even be in the higher percentiles of people in younger age brackets. Okay, so can I keep the same body composition I had 10 years ago? And 10 years from now, can I still keep those numbers the same as when I was in 35? And when I'm 65, are the numbers as good as when I was 35? When I'm 75, are the numbers as good as I was 30? So that's why, like, even once a year, if you get that data, this is going to help you over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years to have these baselines that you can aspire towards.
Right. And another thing, too, that I don't think is talked about hardly ever is companies go out of business and the tools that you were using, like the Zeo, become
obsolete.
Brick.
Yeah, it's in the boneyard.
Out of it, you can't retrieve it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's why having copies of all of this stuff, like you said, DEXA scans, you can get them anywhere nowadays, but having access to this information in different formats as well. With our system, with the DEXA scan, you just get this PDF file. I'm like, okay, great. I got 20 of these PDF files. What the heck am I going to do with these? So like, I was stuck up went on a snowboarding trip and we got rained out. So I just had nothing else to do. I sat in the cabin and I put them all on a spreadsheet just to see the trends in the data. It was really insightful. Now with our system, you just upload the PDF and we'll strip the data out. But you still need the source documents, like you said. There may be some time where maybe our company doesn't exist anymore and you got to go rebuild your health data somewhere else. So you still need the originals, but we're trying to help make it easier to get the trending information.
Yeah, awesome. Now, you also mentioned before we started recording that there are ways to measure biological age.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of those companies and their validity and what sort of actionable insights you'd get from those kind of tests.
There's a taxonomy that I use, which is there's your lifestyle data. This is the stuff we measure at home. It changes day to day. Then you have your labs. That's when you go draw blood and they're going to run your labs. Maybe you get your labs once a year with your annual physical, for example. But now we have a new category of testing, biological age testing. This is actually a way to measure potentially our entire lifespan and measure the rate that we are aging at. And so there's different ways to do what's called a biological age test. There are some companies that use telomeres as an indicator of your biological age, which are just like the caps on the chromosome. And you can look at the integrity of those chromosomal caps and the length of those chromosomal caps. And that has been long established as a very strong indicator of longevity. And what they found is that people who have been through very stressful experiences or who are aging at a very rapid rate, those telomere lengths will be shorter. Conversely, they've seen in people who live long, healthy, extended lifespans, and I'm generalizing here significantly, but they will tend on the whole to have longer telomeres. So that was one of the first ways we started measuring our own rate of aging. And if you and I are the same age, Stephan, and we both measured our telomeres, and we've both led very different lives, we will probably have different results. And the one of us that has the longer telomeres on the average will have a longer, healthier, disease-free life. Once those telomeres wear down, the DNA replication process is more subject to failure or to error, copy-paste errors, basically. And these copy-paste errors introduce the potential for disease. So that's the traditional way of doing it. I've got a couple telomere length tests done. There's a really good company out of Spain called LifeLength. I've used their telomere test. Now there's another company called True Diagnostic, and they're measuring rate of aging on several different scales. They're measuring telomere length. They're also using a new biological age clock that's been discovered. It's called the Dunedin pace clock. And it's a new way of measuring our rate of aging. So for every year chronologically on the calendar that you age, this will tell you how much you're aging biologically. So when I ran my test, it said for every year on the calendar, you're only aging at 0.83 of a year. So I'm actually, because of all the things I'm doing with my health, I'm aging at a rate slower than the calendar year. And they're collecting massive amounts of data sets, and they're looking at DNA methylation pathways to figure out how people are at the rate at which they're aging. So I've used the True Diagnostic Test. And if you follow any of the work by Brian Johnson and these other guys, you can go to this website called Rejuvenation Olympics. And it's all of these hardcore longevity hackers. They're all uploading their True Diagnostic results. And they're looking at who's able to improve the most. And then what are they doing to improve? So there's communities building to figure out what is actually able to slow our rate of aging the most. So if you check out Rejuvenation Olympics, this is now a community of people sharing their longevity test results and sharing protocols to figure out what's working. It's really fun and exciting. And if you've got a little bit of a competitive angle in you, then you can jump in the game and start seeing how well you can move. And then, Stephan, just in closing, there's other tests that will just run regular routine blood work, but they have developed algorithms that can give you a good indication of biological age through routine blood work. And then there's a company called Glycan Age. They've developed a way to test the glycation on the proteins. I'll probably butcher this, but they've got another, let's just call it another method for assessing biological age relative to chronological age. So this is a new type of testing, and these tests are getting better. They're getting more sophisticated. They're capturing more data. Their algorithms get better. Their data set gets better. That's the great thing about crowdsourcing it from. They get a couple million people that do their test. With the right machine learning, those tests are going to get increasingly accurate. So now we have some tools to really start to measure our lifespan. And again, I'll quote Peter Attia here. He's like, you get these bonus decades, 60, 70, 80. How do you optimize for the bonus decades? Well, first thing you do is you start looking at some of these age rate clocks that we've discovered. And where do you stack up against other people your age? And just right there, just like the Zio, Stephan, just seeing that number relative to my peers, okay, I have some work to do. And now what am I going to do about it? And then you go down the rabbit hole.
What's been the most surprising thing you've found going down these various rabbit holes?
It's a good question. I would say that you just have to have this attitude of never stop learning, I would say, because the science is changing so quickly. Our understanding of health is changing very, very quickly. I think just being able to, first of all, not get overwhelmed. That's the first thing I would counsel to people, because, man, as soon as you start working on your health and you start acquiring information, it's like a tsunami of stuff you can find out there. And it can get very overwhelming very fast for people just getting into this game. So I think I've had to really learn how to just be able to not get overwhelmed with information, be able to take in information and decide what from that I want to process and what I want to discard, being able to pick one or two things at a time that I want to try and measure, and just working on a couple things that I can really test objectively and get some feedback. And then as I mentioned, it's always changing. As science evolves, I think we have to just keep an open mind. And what we thought works today, in a few years from now, it turns out we might be totally wrong, or there was a completely better way to do it. And so I think just having that kind of like beginner's mind with all of this stuff, and just always being receptive to what's new, being mindful of avoiding dogma. There's a lot of people that are really set in their opinion about how it has to be done in terms of health. And when you see that type of dogma, I usually try to turn in the opposite direction and try to keep an open mind. So those are just, a random collection of things that come up in response to your question.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned peptides earlier in our conversation. What peptides are you taking? Why? What do you recommend? Or what have you heard? I know this is not medical advice. All standard disclaimers apply. Consult your doctor, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, what have you found personally to be effective in terms of peptides?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating new area of research. Obviously, we know what peptides are. Essentially, the building blocks, amino acid building blocks that the body uses to essentially repair, recover, create new the immune system, growth hormones. So, the most popular peptide out there is, of course, insulin, which diabetics use. Type 1 diabetics, type 2 diabetics. So that's a peptide. There's lots of peptides that are out there medicinally and that are FDA approved. Tesamorelin is an FDA approved peptide for abdominal fat loss. So there are lots of them out there that have made it all through the way through clinical trials, and they are now FDA approved. Others are still more in the experimental phase where they just haven't gone through the clinical trials. So some of the ones I use personally, Stephan, I use some of the growth hormone stimulating peptides. So you can go buy growth hormone. That's taking exogenous, which means external to the body. Or you can take the peptides, which will signal to the body to produce its own growth hormone. So there's two peptides I'm currently using there. One is called tesamorelin. The other is called ipamorelin. It's another one called CJC1295. I was taking that when I stopped. So I use some just as, 47-year-old guy wanting to maintain a high level of lean mass growth hormone. So I use those two. I've also tested the GLP-1 weight loss peptides. So I've tested semaglutide, and I had a good experience with that. And I've also tested tirzepatide. So I just restarted tirzepatide. I'll probably go back on to a 12-week cycle. I take a very, very low subclinical dose. Mainly I don't want to suppress my appetite because I want to preserve lean body mass. So I'll take a dose that does not keep my appetite low, but it provides all the other benefits of the peptide, which is inflammation reduction, keeping blood sugar in check. The growth hormone ones I mentioned, I'll occasionally cycle on the GLP-1 weight loss ones. And I've also will regularly use BPC 157. That's just an anti-inflammatory, soft tissue, wound healing, general internal immune boosting peptide. It also works really good with growth hormone peptides. They work synergistically. The BPC actually helps create more receptors for growth hormone. And then I'll occasionally, I always mispronounce this one, but it's a epitalon or epitalon. There's different ways to pronounce it. That's a peptide that targets the pineal gland in the brain. And the pineal gland regulates our melatonin, our sleep-wake, our circadian rhythm. So there's a protocol where you do that once a year for 10 days. So I'm just about to start that again. So I've been cycling through most of them, educating myself as I go, experimenting on myself as I go. I've had mostly positive experiences. I had a bad allergic reaction to one peptide called MOTS-C. You can develop these reactions to any peptide or medication, for example. So I had to stop taking that one. And I had a similar experience after taking CJC1295 for quite some time. I had to stop taking that one and switch over to some different ones for growth hormone. So it's been interesting experimenting with all of these. They're subtle, so it's not like an overnight you're going to see results. But if you have a solid diet and lifestyle, first of all, you have to have a solid foundation or the peptides are a waste of money, just like supplements. If you don't have a good nutrition and exercise and sleep and a foundation, those things are just not really going to work. So I do have all of those foundations, and so I do experiment a lot with those peptides, and I'm sure there's more that will come across our radar screen. The FDA just put the screws down on a lot of the peptides that haven't been thoroughly tested, probably for good reason. It was getting a little too out of control, and I think there were a lot of people who were probably using them without the right level of information. So I do think it was helpful to put some guardrails on there, but for people who do know what they're doing or who are working with a talented practitioner, they can be awesome.
Awesome. And what sort of issues or opportunities are you going after with your hyperbaric therapy?
Well, I've been in this game for a long time, and of everything that's come across my desk, if you ask me to say what's the one thing we have that's closest to the fountain of youth, that would be regular and consistent supplemental oxygen in hyperbaric therapy. It is the safest, most well-tolerated, and effective tool we have to help regenerate every single cell in our body. Even the damaged tissues that the body has a hard time repairing can be improved with hyperbaric therapy vascular health, skin, sleep, inflammation, you name it. I think hyperbaric, and there was just a study that got published on hyperbaric therapy with telomere length, going back to the conversation you and I just had about telomere length. And they showed a 20% improvement in telomere length through hyperbaric therapy. So we can link to that study if we need to. But I just think that one is the one that if I could pick any single one to use for the rest of my life, it would be HBOD. It's oxygenating every cell in our entire body. It leads to new mitochondria. It leads to new energy. It heals damaged tissues. It helps with vascular blockages. It helps with wound healing. And again, just like some of the other things we mentioned, hyperbaric is FDA approved, but it's FDA approved for a very small number of conditions like gangrene, CO2 poisoning, wound healing. So what do us biohackers do? We use it off-label. And what's it approved for off-label? Okay, my insurance is not going to pay for it. But off-label, it works for all of these other things, weight loss, longevity, skin health, better sleep, higher HRV. So we're just off-label. I think it works great for pretty much everything across the board with very few side effects or contraindications.
Cool. And you have one in your home, or you go to some facility nearby?
I do. We have a partnership with a company called OxyHelp, and they have a home use chamber. And the home use chamber, you can actually sit inside of it. There's 2 seats. It looks like a small 2 airplane seats, but more comfortable. So you can go in there, you can sit in the chair, you can lie back, you can watch TV, you can work on your laptop, and you can just go do your hyperbaric therapy for an hour or 2 a day, and also, watch some Netflix or get some work done.
And how much time do you spend in the chamber?
I'm looking to get at least 3 to 5 hours a week. More is obviously better. A typical session, if I'm pressed for time, anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. If I'm not pressed for time, I'll go for a full 2 hours.
What's the biggest impact that you've seen in your metrics by doing this therapy?
What I'm really looking for, Stephan, is heart rate variability improvement. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, I'm looking to get back to those optimal levels I saw back in 2020, 2021. And so that's the one thing I'm looking at. It's only been maybe a month since I've had the chamber, so I don't have enough data, but I'm starting to get consistently back to those levels. What I'd really like to see is, can I even exceed the levels that I had back in 2020, 21? I also have a family member who's got some kidney damage and has some atherosclerosis. So with him, we'll be looking very closely at the kidney markers, creatinine, which is an important marker of kidney function, and then also some of the cardiovascular markers, lipid levels, and also indicators of calcification and inflammation in the arteries. So those are a couple of the things we'll be looking at.
Yeah, so a calcium scan every 5 years or whatever gives you a sense for calcification in the arteries. You mentioned a metric earlier, VO2 max, but you didn't explain it. Could you briefly just explain it?
Oh, wow, man, that one, again, this is one of the most exciting metrics in longevity. It's a measure of your cardiovascular health, which is just, how much oxygen can your body put to use at its peak, the VO2 max. So what is the maximum amount? And then it's an indicator of your cardiorespiratory fitness level. There was another study where I think it was over 100,000 people in this study. So a huge data set. And what they found was, as your VO2 max increased, the rate of all-cause mortality decreased. And what was interesting about this study was there was no upper limit. With a lot of things, there's a point of diminishing return on a curve. There was no point of diminishing return on VO. So the higher you pushed it, there was a corresponding exact proportional decrease in all-cause mortality with no upper limit. So I ran and got my VO2 max tested, Stephan. Much like you, I have all my stuff right at my desk. Here's the printout. Okay, so this shows you VO2 max by age. Okay, so I got my levels tested, and I looked at what I should be at for male, 40 to 49 years old. And I'm in what you would call the average category, which is my average level of cardio fitness. Now, again, if you can start to say, well, what's the optimal range for someone 10 years younger than me? Could I get my VO2 max into the optimal range for someone who's 37? Of course you can. You just have to work on it. So anyhow, the VO2 max is this cardiorespiratory number that is highly correlated with longevity and all-cause mortality. And we can train to increase our VO2 max. And again, that's one of the metrics that will get us into those later stages of life. But what you don't want to do is get to be 60 or 65 or 70 and not even know what VO2 max is, because you potentially missed the boat. You know, if you can get that number now and start optimizing for it and keep it in that top percentile of people your age, you're just doing more to ensure you'll have the absolute highest quality of life possible.
Yeah. Which gets at a very important question that we talked about covering in this interview before we started recording, which is, what's my why? Mm-hmm. Why am I doing all this? Right. So everybody has their own why. And let's talk about what this means for our listener.
When I first started looking at that ZEO data, Stephan, you know, as a newbie in health and wellness, and when I started seeing that data, and when I started realizing that I could actually make steps on my own, absent of a doctor, to start making very significant improvements in my health, you know, that moment, that light bulb moment where this became something fun and motivating and rewarding for me, you know, looking at the numbers, making a change, seeing the improvement, you know, kind of the self-gamification around that. For me, I call it, I became connected to my health at that moment. I left my corporate job, as you and I just talked about not too long ago, jumped off the cliff with no parachute. So the reason I did it was, our mission is to get 100 million people connected to their health, which means they're engaging with their health on a day-to-day basis. They're making changes on a day-to-day basis. They're getting invested in the outcome of their health and not waiting for the doctor to tell us it's time to get invested in our health. That's the why, is giving people this information so they can make smarter, healthier choices every single day. That's longevity to me, is the choices we make day to day, compounded over 40 years.
Yeah. So, you know, somebody who wants to quit smoking but hasn't achieved that needs a bigger why. If somebody makes some improvement in their health, they've figured out that there's a big enough why in order to do so. And if they haven't made that change, then they haven't connected it to a why that matters enough.
And there's a lot of people who it's perfectly okay. You know what I mean? If this, everybody's motivated by different things in their life. Some people love watching sports. You know, some people love tracking their financial performance in the stock market, traders. Our system is for people who want to do that for their health. And as you mentioned, sometimes, sadly, you do have to have the oh shit moment before you're ready to make change. For some people, it just becomes natural and organic and something they do. But by human nature, sometimes we have to have a very serious, in some cases, near-death experience before we're really ready to make change. In closing, Stephan, I'll just say, sorry, that's also, this is a slightly controversial topic, but it also starts to get into the promise of psychedelic therapy. And what that allows us to do is potentially tap into the things that are blocking us subconsciously that we're not in touch with. And can we remove those blockers that are below our level of consciousness so that we can make those changes easier and understand what's holding us back?
Have you done any psychedelic therapy or experiences, journeys, anything?
It's been a profound part of my own personal journey, part of my own self-awareness, part of my own spirituality. So it's something I've worked with in the past. I will probably return to again at some point in the future. It's helpful to be able to let go of the things we accumulate into society from time to time. Mm-hmm. So I look at it as like dropping some baggage we don't need, spring cleaning, emotional stuff that we can just drop off. So yeah, in that regard, you know, I just had a fascinating interview with a woman on my podcast, and she uses ketamine therapy for people who have eating disorders, anorexia nervosa, bulimia. She's trying to figure out, why do they have the eating disorder? Okay, we know you have it. but why? And so with the ketamine, she can figure out what the trauma was earlier in that person's life that led to the eating disorder. So that's an example of where these can become very medically useful. And now the person intellectually understands the trauma and can make the change and can start losing the weight. Before, all they knew was they were overeating for a reason, but they didn't know, what was really triggering that. And so I'm encouraged to see where we can go with more of these psychospiritual medicines that are now becoming FDA approved.
Yeah. We live in interesting times for sure. Awesome.
Amen.
And one last kind of mundane question, but I'm super curious. Do you wear an Apple Watch?
I wear an Apple Watch religiously during the day, and I track all of my physical workouts on Apple Watch. So I just went for a run this morning, put the watch on, go for a 30-minute run. When I go to bed, I take it off and I wear the ring. I think Aura's really, their zone of genius is in what happens to you when you're asleep. And I think for functional utility, I wear the Apple Watch during the day. I use both.
Okay, but you're not wearing it right now, are you?
I took it off because when I'm working at the computer, it tends to get in the way. It's right here. I'll put it back on as soon as I step up from my desk.
So you don't need it 24/7. You just need it during your run.
I like it to keep track of my physical movement, my activity levels, my step count, my workouts. That's mainly what I use the watch for.
Gotcha. So when you're sitting sedentary getting interviewed, you'll take it off.
Yeah, I don't know. It just gets in the way of the keyboard and stuff. So I take it off at my desk. But as soon as I step up from the desk, or I do record all of my workouts, it's really interesting to see how hard I'm pushing myself, what heart rate zones I'm in, and then also just how many total calories burned am I doing on a monthly basis. Those are some of the things I use the watch for. So tracking workouts, Garmin, Apple Watch, Whoop, they're all great for really giving you good hard data on your workouts for the fitness junkies out there.
All right. Well, that was an awesome interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your story and all your exploration and optimization work, all the cool tools that you've identified, and of course, the amazing tool that you've created. So we'll include links in the show notes for all the stuff that we've discussed. But of course, to wrap up this interview, what is the website and the most important resource for our listener to go to that you've developed?
Yeah, thanks, Stephan. So our website is headsuphealth.com. You can set up an individual dashboard. You can start measuring things, and you can start tinkering. And then for practitioners as well, we have a way to deploy the dashboards to patients so that you can help to collect data and understand what's happening to patients between the visits. That's our contribution here is the tools to measure. So that's at headsuphealth.com. And if you want to reach me, you can shoot an email to support@headsuphealth.com. And that will get to me personally. And then there was a few studies I mentioned, Stephan. I'll send you the links to the studies. So there was one on telomeres and one on VO2 max. If your listeners are interested in checking those out, they were really well done. And there's some good reasons in there to want to understand the why behind those numbers. So I'll forward those along as well.
Great. And we'll put those in the show notes along with all the other stuff that we discussed. Awesome. Thank you again, David. Thank you, listener. Go out there, make it a great week. We'll catch you in the next episode. In the meantime, I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.